Good evening. My name is Jack Rowe. I'm a senior here at Hillsdale College, and I'm studying history and politics, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. John Lott is founder and president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. He received his BA, MA, and PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, and has held research or teaching positions at the University of Chicago, the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, Stanford University, Yale University, and Rice University. A former chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission, Dr. Lott recently served in the Trump administration as senior advisor for research and statistics at the United States Department of Justice, where he also studied voter fraud. He has written for numerous academic papers and other popular articles, including in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, Town Hall, the Daily Caller, Real Clear Politics, and the Federalist. He's also the author of 10 books, including More Guns, Less Crime, and Dumbing Down the Courts, How Politics Keeps the Smartest Judges Off the Bench. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. John Lott.
Thanks very much. Okay. Well, if I knew having a title, Carter Baker Commission, would get a big crowd like this, I would have been using it more often before now. I really appreciate you guys inviting me. This is actually the third time that I've been invited to give talks at Hillsdale. I've even met professors here who have decided to come and heckle me if necessary that are in the front. But it's good to be back. It's amazing how much just to see the campus grows each time between my different trips here. So I've been asked to talk about vote fraud, essentially, because that's really what the Carter Baker Commission dealt with. And, I just go through obviously some very radical reforms here. You have propose a uniform system of voter identification based on, quote, real ID card or an equivalent for people without a driver's license. Absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential vote fraud. Invalid voter files which contain ineligible, duplicate, fictional, or deceased voters are an invitation to fraud. And citizens who vote at home or at nursing homes, at the workplace, or in church are more susceptible to pressure, overt and subtle, or to intimidation. Vote buying schemes are far more difficult when citizens vote by mail. So you would think, what is this, Trump making all these statements? Actually, this was statements, along with others, that you can find in the Carter Baker Commission report that came out in 2005. It's just not Jimmy Carter who is on the commission there. You see people like former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle was a major member of it, former Indiana Democratic Congressman Lee Hamilton, and of course you had Republicans on there like Bob Michels, the former minority leader for the Republicans in the House. But you have all sorts of all-stars on there, and it's amazing how much things have changed over the last 15, 16 years. Some of the people, like Jimmy Carter, last year came out and basically disavowed the earlier commission reports that are there. But among the things that they pointed out is voters in nearly 100 democracies use a photo ID card with fear of infringement on their rights. And, that's 100 countries out of 115 countries that are democracies in the world that require voter ID. And the thing is, we hear how radical a lot of these proposals are, but if you look at surveys, there was a Rasmussen survey that came out just a week or so ago that showed that 80% of Americans support government-issued photo IDs to be able to vote. 84% of minorities support it. 77% of non-Hispanic whites support it. If you look at other questions like Do you think that there was significant fraud that could have reversed the outcome of the election last year? 49% of Americans believe that. So that may not be a majority, but it's surely a large number of people that are concerned about the outcome of the election. You know, on the other hand, just to get an idea of how extreme the debate is, I'm not going to go through too much of this because we could be here just going through these types of claims. But Biden, just in July, was making some remarks in Philadelphia at the Constitution Center. He said, so hear me clearly, there is an unfolding assault taking place in America today, an attempt to suppress and subvert the right to vote in free and fair elections, an assault on democracy, an assault on liberty, an assault on who we are as Americans. He basically was talking about the requirement to have photo IDs to be able to go and vote. He had just gotten back from Europe, where he said, I just got back from Europe speaking to the G7 and to NATO, and they wonder, not a joke, they wonder, Gov, they ask me, is it going to be okay? The citadel of democracy in the world, is it going to be okay? And of course, he compares it to the Civil War in terms of people trying to bring us back to slavery and what have you. So pretty extreme statements. Unfortunately, Biden's not alone in terms of making these statements. You read the New York Times, the Washington Post, or really any major newspaper, and you get very similar statements. The New York Times labeled state ID and voting laws as showing, quote, the Republican Party's growing discomfort with democracy, end quote, or the proposals are dangerously anti-democratic. The Washington Post has terms like anti-democratic virus. And of course, I'm sure you've seen this where any claims about vote fraud are immediately preceded by saying false or, I'm sure you can fill in the blanks, lies or whatever that they want to go and claim it. One of the things that's been interesting, I write a lot of op-ed pieces. I probably have written, I noticed you didn't mention the New York Times, Jack, in pieces I've written. But anyway, I've sent out pieces on the vote fraud type issues to major op-ed editors around the country. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been told things like, well, I can't take this. If we run a piece like this, then we'll be censored on social media. And, that's kind of the kiss of death to them. They want to have a large amount of circulation there and people reading their pieces. So what I'm going to go through a little bit is, first of all, just talk about how other countries run their elections. And I guess the bottom line to me, and I think you'll see this over the next few minutes, is that if it's really true that the Republicans wanting to have voter IDs or some of the other reforms that they want are anti-democratic, then really all the democracies just about in the world are anti-democratic. So, so this is a map of Europe. There are 47 countries in Europe. And this is just the rules that they have for voter IDs, government-issued photo voter IDs for people to be able to vote. There are the 47 countries in Europe right now, 46 and a half of them currently require government-issued photo IDs to be able to vote. The one exception is part of the UK. You have to have voter IDs in Northern Ireland, and you have to have it for many local elections in England. But I don't know if you've been following, but in fact this week, the British Parliament is considering legislation proposed by the government there, Boris Johnson's government, to require that all the elections in Britain will require, and the UK will require, government-issued photo IDs to be able to go and vote. So pretty soon, within the next few months, all 47 countries in Europe are going to require government-issued photo IDs to be able to vote. And one of the things that's interesting when you kind of look at the history of these things is how, unlike the United States, you have real agreement across the political spectrum. So you look at Northern Ireland, for example. The first reforms that they had in Northern Ireland were in 1985 under Margaret Thatcher, who was obviously conservative. And they instituted ID requirements that were there. And then in 2002, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, Labour government in England, Tony Blair argued that there was vote fraud that was occurring in Northern Ireland because people were making counterfeit IDs. And so he wanted to have more tamper-proof IDs that were there. And so he passed legislation that required that people had to have these relatively tamper-resistant voter IDs to be able to go and vote. So you have both conservatives and Labour working together in very similar ways there to try to reduce the vote fraud. And one of the things that was interesting after they passed this, the Labour government claims that they were able to show that about 11% of the people who had been on the voting rolls in Northern Ireland were actually non-existent people. And so they took credit for clearing that up. And also a few years after that, when kind of the statute of limitations for criminal activity with regard to vote fraud had kind of run its course in Northern Ireland, some academics went and interviewed the leaders of some of the political parties there, in particular Sinn Féin. And one of the things, they got a former leader for Sinn Féin to go and talk about all the ways they did vote fraud, about how they would go and have literally armies of cab drivers driving people from one polling place to another, how they would set up big printing presses to go and print off these fake IDs for individuals. And they'd have houses set up in order to kind of have people have extra precautions by changing their clothes between going to different polling places. But one of the things that's clear when you read these government reports that were done was their recognition of how incredibly difficult and hard it was to go and catch and prove vote fraud. Unless somebody was so stupid that they would actually go and try voting multiple times at the same polling place. How are you, and if they have a fake ID indicating that they were who they said they were trying to vote for, how would you know that they were going and committing fraud by voting multiple times? I mean, there are a few cases where some really bright person tried to vote multiple times at the same polling place, and maybe the guy was like 6'7" or something like that and wore flashy clothes, so they were able to catch him. Or there are a few times where people would brag on social media about the number of times that they were able to go and vote, and so that they were caught. But the British government at the time understood how difficult it was in order to go and prove cases of vote fraud that were there. And yet, if you look at the polling in Northern Ireland back in 2002, 64% of likely voters in Northern Ireland believed that there was significant enough vote fraud in Northern Ireland to change the outcome of elections. Only 10% of Northern Ireland voters didn't believe that that was a significant problem. So you can see just with voter IDs how it kind of works. Now here's absentee ballots. I know when I first learned this, it kind of blew me away. In the United States, we're so used to having very liberal rules for absentee ballots. The blue countries here are the ones that ban absentee ballots for people living in their country. So 74% of European countries completely ban absentee ballots for people living in their country. A third of these countries even ban absentee ballots for people living outside of the country. So if you're in one of those countries and you want to vote in the election and you may be residing in the United States, you have to get back to your home country in order to go and vote in the election. Now there are other countries, 21% of the countries have absentee ballots, but they require that you have to have a government-issued photo ID to actually go and physically pick up the ballot. They will not send it in the mail. And some of those countries limit the absentee ballots to people who are either in the military or in the hospital at the time. But it's not like here in the United States where you say, you just let the voter register know that you're going to be out of town and they send you a ballot. In those countries, you have to have third-party verification. You have to have the military or the hospital verify that you will not be available to go and vote. They just don't take your word for it at that time. A number of these countries used to have rules similar to what we have in the United States. France, for example, up until 1975, had rules similar to what we've had. But they discovered massive vote fraud. In the island of Corsica, they found that literally hundreds of thousands of dead people were voting. And also, even larger scale vote buying operations were occurring. And apparently that had been going on for decades, only because a couple people, I guess, had guilty enough consciences that they went to the prosecutors there, that the whole plan was unraveled and they were able to go and find out about it. But at that stage, France then banned absentee ballots. Just as an aside, one thing, Mike Barone last night was mentioning how people used to vote with colored paper that the parties would give. What you may not have known, he may have filled this in a little bit more, is that the secret ballot is relatively new in the United States. The first states to adopt secret ballot in the United States were in 1880. The last state to adopt a secret ballot in the United States was 1950 in South Carolina. Does anybody know what happened to the rate that people voted when you had the secret ballot go into effect? It fell pretty dramatically. You saw about a 12 percentage point drop in the rate that people voted when secret ballots went into effect. Now, why would that be? Why instituting a secret ballot, why would that cause a huge drop? Because maybe it falls from like, 64% turnout rate down to 52% turnout rate. That's a large drop in voter turnout because you have a secret ballot. Well, the reason is because people used to get paid for voting. That what would happen is the different party officials would stand on either side of the ballot box. They'd give out people the colored pieces of paper, and then they could see what colored piece of paper you put in the ballot box. And if you put in theirs, they'd pay you off. If you put in the other guys, they weren't going to pay you. When you went to secret ballot, though, they could no longer tell who you were voting for. And so, you could go and tell them that you voted for them, but since they couldn't be sure, touch it. I didn't have my hand in my pocket. You guys are my witnesses, did I? Anyway, so I'll keep my hands out of my pockets. So anyway, that's essentially what these countries learned with regard to absentee ballots too. That if you have an absentee ballot, you can show somebody how you voted and you can get paid off. And obviously we run into these types of problems with vote harvesting. People come around, you show them how you're voting and then they take the ballot and then they can pay you because they're sure how you voted in the election there. There's only two countries that have rules somewhat similar to what we have. That's Hungary and Germany. Hungary, according to different international reports, has been a mess. In the 2018 election that they had the incumbent party, I'm sure this is very believable, got 96% of the absentee ballots. And because of that, they just barely got enough votes to have a supermajority. So they need 60%, and I'm sure it's quite likely, I mean, Gary knows statistics too, that was purely a likely outcome that's there. So, and England used to have rules similar to ours, but in 2004 in Birmingham, England, they discovered a massive vote buying scheme or vote fraud scheme by, in the city council races there. It looked like the city council members, the 6 Labor people who won, had stolen about 40,000 ballots, mainly from Muslim areas of the city. Apparently, the Labor Party was concerned with Tony Blair in office there and involvement in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the Muslims there were not going to vote for Labor as they normally did. And so as a precaution, they went out and stole the ballots. These guys went to jail. The judge found that it was, in his words, was a massive vote fraud scheme that had occurred. And as a result of that, England became one of those countries that require that you have to show a voter ID to pick up the ballot, and they will not send it in the mail. The notion of sending absentee ballots in the mail, let alone mail-in ballots, I mean, I assume you all know the difference. Absentee ballot, you have to go and request the ballot to be given to you, and mail-in ballots, they just send it out to everybody. There is one country that temporarily this last year had mail-in ballots, and that was Poland, and it was pretty much a disaster. They believed that there was a lot of fraud that had occurred, and they ended the experiment. They're not going to do it again. And in fact, because of the experience in Poland, none of the other countries followed suit because their election was relatively early in the year. There were 2 cities in Russia that also changed their rules, but that's it. No other country in Europe went to the type of mail-in ballot that we've had in the United States. So, this work, this work that I'm showing you is stuff that I had done originally last fall in August. And after the election, Trump actually used the work that we had. I don't know if you remember this January or December 2nd speech that he gave, the one that he said might be the most important in his career. He said out of 42 European nations, all but 2 prohibit absentee ballots entirely for people who reside inside the country, or else they require those who need absentee ballots to show a very, very powerful ID. It just gives you a type of way that the media deals with these things. So the Washington Post gave, described it as Trump's 46-minute rant and gave him 3 Pinocchios out of 4. The explanation was that Glenn Kessler, somebody who I know, notes the fact that countries require photo IDs requirement is a red herring, given that many of these countries have national ID cards. Just before I finish reading this, well, not all of them do. And in any case, I'm not really sure what that has to do with saying it's not useful to have people identify who they are. You can have a national ID card and not require that people have to show it, right, to be able to go and vote. But apparently they require that you have to show it. In their other countries that don't have national ID cards that require you have photo ID. Some of them require you have to show your passport. It also ignores that countries have other ways to accommodate voters who cannot go to the polls, such as proxy voting. So the point here is they say, okay, well, it's literally true that these countries require photo IDs, but there's something called proxy voting where you can go and get somebody else, allow them to go and vote for you in some of these countries. And so, they got 3 Pinocchios out of 4 because they said it was misleading. I'll get to that in a second. In the end, it's clear that some of the largest countries in Europe, such as Britain, Germany, Spain, Poland, allow voters to cast ballots by mail. And as I said, that's true because there are 8 countries, but what you find is that most of these countries require that you have to have IDs to pick it up, and they won't send it to you in the mail. So it's a little bit misleading. But the thing is, let's look at this proxy voting. So proxy voting is you may be out of the country or you may be sick, and so 8 of these countries allow you to be able to go and designate somebody else. But it's just not the person shows up at the polls and say, I'm going to vote for Gary or something like that. What they do is they have all sorts of different rules. So first of all, of the 47 countries, 39 of them ban proxy voting. Of the 8 that have it, you have a couple of them here, Poland, for example, and Monaco, this little dot right there, limited to reasons such as disability, illness, or out of the country, requires approval of the local mayor, okay? Or in the case of Monaco, it requires the general secretariat, essentially the guy who runs all law enforcement in the area. So, and when you read into this, basically the local mayor knows the people that are coming in, or he won't approve it. And then other countries limited to those reasons with disability, illness, or out of the country. But the thing is, or they require that you have to have a notary to be able to go and do it. You go through these issues. It's only really some of the cantons in Switzerland which have relatively liberal rules, and they only require signature matching that's there. So they don't even take just the word for it. That would be closer to our absentee ballot requirements that they have when we actually do check the signatures. But as you probably know, a lot of the states this last year didn't even bother to check signatures. So, it's a little bit misleading just to say, well, countries do it, and so I'm going to give Trump 3 Pinocchios out of 4 for being misleading. The thing is, these rules aren't just in Europe, okay? There are 37 countries that are members of the OECD, kind of the club of developed countries. You could also include Russia and Brazil, which meet the technical requirements in terms of economic development, but aren't included because of political issues that are there. If you do that, then they're very restrictive. Both Brazil and Russia require government-issued IDs. In Russia, you have to have a passport to vote or a military ID, and they also ban absentee ballots. So out of the 37 countries, 33 of them require that you have to have a government-issued photo ID to vote. The only exceptions are the UK, which we've already talked about, which is kind of half the rule, and they're changing right now. And the other ones are Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. But even those countries tend to have stricter rules than we have. So Japan, for example, is you get a unique identifier number. It's kind of like your Social Security number that they send out to all the voters. And you have to turn that in, and then we'll check it when you get in there to vote. And now if you lose it, or if you accidentally bring a relative's number in with you, they'll still let you vote, but they'll usually require then that you have to have a photo ID with you so they can go and check who you are at that point. In New Zealand, they also have a very similar system to what they have in Japan. Technically, it's possible to vote if you lose your ID number that's there. They have a computer system where they check, and then they'll ask you questions to try to verify who you are. They'll ask you how long you've been living at the particular residence that you're at. I'm sure none of you have been asked those types of questions when you've gone and voted any place in the United States. Australia has the loosest rules of any of these countries. They're probably most similar to what we have in the United States. And what they do there, they ask you 3 questions: your name, your address, and whether you voted in the last election. I suppose whether you voted in the last election provides at least a tiny bit of protection, but obviously it's not the same as any of these other countries. How about our 2 neighbors here? Mexico and Canada. Mexico had a long history of vote fraud. The 1988 election was one that at least a number of people believe the extreme left-wing candidate should have won that election. After, I think it was like 2004, the person who was president of Mexico, De la Madrid, at that time wrote his autobiography, and in that he talked about the fact that he acknowledged that there was a lot of fraud that had occurred at that election. And so what happened after that, because basically Mexico was concerned about foreign investment, and if they weren't perceived as a democracy, that they would lose what investment that they were getting. And so they instituted fairly strict reforms. They have a biometric ID, which not only has your picture, but a thumbprint. So when you go and vote in Mexico, they take your thumbprint, and it actually serves as two things. One is they figure your picture is not enough to guarantee who you are, but they also have indelible ink that they put on your thumb, which makes it a little bit more, even more difficult for you to vote multiple times during the day that's there. And they also banned absentee ballots, including for people outside of the country. And also, they wouldn't send you your ID in the mail. You had to go to physically apply for it the first time, and you had to go a second time in order to go and pick it up, which could be a month later. And the thing you have to understand is that in most Mexican states, there was only one place to go in the state to go and apply and pick up your government-issued voter ID. In some of these states, you may be talking about people have to travel 75 or 100 miles each way to be able to go and get their ID. Now, you would think with all these changes, there should have been a huge drop-off in the rate that people voted in Mexico, right? I mean, you talk about voter suppression, making people have to travel these long distances to be able to go and vote, making it so that they have to get these IDs and they can't do absentee voting. Surely there must have been a big drop-off. No, the opposite happened. In the 3 presidential elections prior to these reforms, the average voter turnout was 59%. In the 3 presidential elections after the reform, the average voter turnout was 68%. That's a pretty 9 percentage point increase when you're talking about a base of 59%. That's a large increase that's there. And they've done surveys on why is it that they're having this big increase. I mean, I'm not even sure they needed to do the survey. But what they found was that people had a lot more confidence that their votes mattered, that they actually could have an impact on the election. And so, they thought it was worthwhile to vote when they didn't previously think that. And so it gives you some idea to the extent that we have 49% of the people that I mentioned before who may believe that there was significant vote fraud that occurred in that election. That's one way of suppressing the vote, making sure that people don't believe or at least question whether or not their votes matter. Canada, our neighbor to the north, also requires photo IDs. They don't have thumbprints on it, though there is an exception. If you don't have an ID with you, you can still vote if you declare who you are and you do it in writing, and you have somebody there who's working at the polling station who can vouch for who you are, okay? So, you kind of compare this to H.R. 1 that they're trying to pass in Congress right now. I don't know if they're going to put it in on the reconciliation. There's talks of them doing that. But, reconciliation, all that, you can get that through with a majority vote. You can't filibuster it. And it just has to be tied to spending. And since H.R. 1 is basically determining whether or not states get money or not based on their voting rules, they can, it seems plausible that they may end up putting this in the next couple months in the different budget bills that they have. But one of the things that they have in there is that they would essentially ban photo IDs or any type of ID. All you have to do and vote under H.R. 1 is say who you are, okay? And if you sign a statement saying I am Joe Blow or whatever, then they're supposed to take your word for it. I'm sure nobody would lie on doing that. And also they will basically force states to move into kind of permanent mail-in voting that we've seen this last year. So, just kind of look at the debate that we've been having in different states. I mean, Texas, obviously you all know we had the state legislature there, the Democrats in the state house leave the state and go to Washington, D.C. In order to try to stop voting on it. What were they most upset about? The thing that they were most upset about was that Harris County had these ballot boxes that Zuckerberg had put out there, and the Republicans in the state legislature wanted to limit the time that those ballot boxes would be out between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. And the Democrats were arguing, well, there are people who want to vote at 3 a.m. in the morning, and they were arguing it was a significant number of people that wanted to vote at that time. And I can't find a country in the world that leaves ballot boxes unattended, okay? And I know 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. is really tight for most of us, but that was what they were most upset about. They were also upset in both Georgia and Texas because they were requiring that you'd have to put down a unique identifier number on your absentee ballot, either your driver's license number or your last 4 digits of your Social Security number. It seems like everybody, all American citizens, even those who aren't American citizens, have Social Security numbers. And but even that is less restrictive than these European countries. 95% of European countries have stricter rules with regard to absentee ballots than we have here in the United States. As I said, 74% of those countries ban it. No state in the United States bans absentee ballots. And putting down a unique number like the last 4 digits of your Social Security number, none of those 95% of the countries do that. You have either it's banned or you have to have a government-issued photo ID to go and physically pick up the ballot. And they won't send it in the mail. Here they put them in the mail. So I guess my bottom line is if by these rules, Sweden, France, and the rest of Europe, and virtually all the developed world must not be democratic countries, if you believe the type of rhetoric that's out there. Just wanted to mention something about the California recall, and I guess this deals with mail-in voting just in general. And that is, you may have seen some of the news stories, like in Torrance, California, police found 300 recall ballots and multiple California driver's license in a felon's car. He had kind of passed out in front of a 7-Eleven, so it was only by accident that the police went to go and check on him that they discovered all these mail-in ballots in his car. In San Fernando Valley and other places in California, election officials were telling Republican voters that they had already voted. Now, you listen to the news, and they say, well, these are easily fixable things. The people that you find that this guy had ballots for, because their names are on the ballots, he said all you do to fix that is send out new ballots to those people who this guy had the ballots for. And as far as people being told that they had already voted, there's an easy fix for that too. They say you just provide them provisional ballots, and if the ballot that they had before hasn't been counted already and can be segregated out, then we'll use the provisional ballot. Here's the problem, though, and that is, one of the things that the Carter-Baker Commission pointed out is it's hard to catch people who have stolen ballots out there, okay? But let's say, obviously we sent it out to the ones that we did catch, but the other problem that you have is that not everybody's going to try to vote. You look at the recall election that they just had in California, they had a 40% turnout rate. So let's say 1,000 ballots were stolen, 400 people went to go and vote, and for those 400 people, I gave them provisional ballots. What do you do about the other 600 people that didn't try to vote that somebody voted for them? You have no mechanism to go and fix that. So if you had Republicans' ballots who had been taken, you had 600 votes, however they wanted to go and vote for those 600 Republicans that were there that never found out that they had somebody else vote for them because they didn't try to vote themselves. Now there's some trouble. I'm going to go through something that you probably haven't heard of yet, and it's just starting to come out, and it's going to come out over the next few months. But there's been a project that's been going on to try to look at vote fraud in different states. And there's just a simple approach right now, and that is the way I would argue Democrats often have done the vote fraud is they'll go and find out who hasn't voted and then vote for them, okay? But what I believe happened in this last election was that the Republican turnout was so large that Democrats were kind of caught flat-footed, and they didn't have the time to go through the normal niceties to see who had already voted, and so they put in a lot of ballots. And in Pennsylvania, there's a news story. You can go to our website at crimeresearch.org. I have a link to the news stories. They're just coming out in the last couple weeks. But they found 56,000 more votes counted than people who were listed as having voted. In Nevada, it was 8,900. In Wisconsin, it's not public yet, but it'll probably come out next week. It's going to show it's about 92,000. And I was actually involved a little bit in something that happened in Missoula County, which is where I live, where they found 4,592 more votes counted than there were ballot envelopes, and all the votes were supposed to be by mail. There are other issues. I have some research that I've done that I did while I was at the Department of Justice, as Jack was nice enough to mention. I was at the Department of Justice up until January. And I looked at a lot of different type of evidence. I'm not going to bore you with the statistics right now. But one of the things I looked at that I think is pretty easy to understand is just the voter turnout rate. And I looked at the 10 states that were listed as swing states. And more heavily Republican counties had much higher turnout rates in this past election than they had in 2016. More heavily Democratic counties actually tended to have slightly lower turnout rates, except for the counties where fraud was alleged. And those Democratic counties had very high turnout rate. So why, if you compare, let's say, Mecklenburg County in North Carolina and Fulton County in Georgia, both of them are in swing states. Why wouldn't you see high turnout rate in both of those? They're demographically fairly similar. And I tried to control for demographics also. Or Allegheny County or Philadelphia in Pennsylvania versus Cuyahoga County in Ohio, or the county that Columbus, Ohio's in. You would imagine, why not have higher turnout rates in both of those? But it's just in the ones where you had the fraud being alleged that you saw a much higher turnout. And I could go on. But I don't want you to have to take my word for these things. If you're interested, there are different references. I have a paper that I did that goes through, and you can actually see the voting rules in different countries. There's an appendix at the back that goes, and 150-page appendix that goes and shows you the rules and original sources for each country, so you can check that. You don't have to rely on the Washington Post. And if you go to our website at crimeresearch.org, you'll see like the news articles I was just talking about and other things on vote fraud. And the people who have been kind of the face of the ones that are doing the stuff in Pennsylvania and these other states is a website called voteref.org. They actually today came out with some work that we've been doing on North Carolina. And in North Carolina, unlike these other states, they only found a gap of 50 between the number of people who voted and the number of votes counted and the number of people who were recorded as voting. So you can see you have a state where there wasn't really allegations of fraud that was occurring, how close they line up compared to the other states where there were. Anyway, I found that interesting. So, again, just kind of leave you thinking about why is the United States so different from all these other countries? Are all these other countries delusional in terms of believing that fraud occurs? Have they all been mistaken? Are they all mistaken in terms of changing these rules over time? Something to think about. Maybe we're the only ones that think that nobody commits fraud. But just as an aside, you try to get vaccines this year, you have to go and show IDs in order to get, so I guess people have an incentive to claim that they're somebody that they're not in order to get vaccines, but not in terms of voting. Thank you very much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Lott. We now have time for some Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way to a microphone, and please note that student questions will be given preference.
Given all of your research on voter integrity and election integrity, what have you found are the best voter regulations to ensure election integrity?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is having some type of voter ID on people. I also would get rid of absentee ballots. I'm not delusional. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But, if you're going to have early voting, set it up so that people have a place to go to. If you are going to insist on having absentee ballots, I would adopt the rules that you see in almost all of Europe. Either ban it or require people to have IDs to go and pick it up. Don't send it in the mail. We've had enough elections where people have, gone and stolen ballots from people's mailboxes and stuff. And I lived in Nevada up through the beginning of last year, and they were having an election. And I lived in an apartment building. And you'd go and walk through the mailroom, and there'd be like ballots all over the floor, And I was getting mail from people who had lived there like 3 or 4 tenants ago. So, it's hard to believe that people think that those types of systems aren't not going to involve fraud. But the most important thing is to require that people have to have a photo ID, and I would limit, either eliminate or limit as much as possible access to absentee ballots. Okay, go ahead. Just don't forget the guy down here.
Over here.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much for your presentation. This is excellent information on our system and our process for casting ballots, and I really appreciate it. But I wonder, it's not just about who votes in elections, it's how you count the votes. Could you comment some on our system for tabulating votes and the 3 companies that provide voting machines and how they tabulate those votes and why they send these tabulations over the internet and why some of the tabulations are done in foreign countries? There's a lot of skepticism about that, and I just wonder if you might be able to enlighten us.
Yeah. I guess my view is there's enough problem areas that I wouldn't get into worrying about too much these voting machines, because I think, one, I'm dubious on how much fraud is there. I have to say, I'm just drawing a blank on the name of the lawyer. What's her name? The one that said, release the Kraken? What? Sidney Powell, right. She did. I like Sydney, and I've known her off and on for years, but she did real damage to the thing to go out and say, release the Kraken, and we're going to have all this stuff. and then never providing the evidence that she claimed that she was going to be having. I think I know what happened with the story there. I don't know why I'm going blank on names, but there's a guy, Frank Gaffney. He basically convinced her that he had evidence that Venezuela was involved in the vote counting machines that were there. And I don't think she checked it out enough before she started making comments. And then when it became clear to her that the evidence that he had wasn't really solid, then she was stuck with it. And she couldn't go forward, and she couldn't walk it back, apparently. And it was just a mess. But the problem that you face is that you don't go and throw up 50 pieces of evidence and just hope, your best evidence sticks on the wall there. You have to go with stuff you're certain about, because if you put weak stuff out there, that's what they're going to go after, and then they're going to discredit you, and they're not going to look at the solid evidence that you have. And so I think it was a real disservice that you don't speak out on things until you are certain about these things.
Sir, my name's Tom. I ran polling places in Tennessee for several years. I required voter ID. It was my understanding that Indiana and Tennessee passed a law for voter ID, and that the challenge in the Supreme Court said that it was constitutional.
Right. There are states that have voter IDs,
Okay.
but not all states have voter IDs. And a number of states have IDs like, bring in a copy of your electric bill. I don't know if you remember this story, but a few election cycles ago, there was a case in Northern Virginia. Congressman Moran, his son, basically ran the field operations for his congressional campaign. And Project Veritas got him on film going in explaining how you do vote fraud, which is basically you wait to see who hasn't voted, and then they have a van with a printer with the right kind of paper from the utility company there, and then they print off a utility bill for the person. They go in and they vote for the people that haven't voted yet. And he was let go from the campaign for saying that. It was a little embarrassing given that it was his dad whose campaign he was working on there. But my understanding is that's pretty much the way that they've done vote for. I used to teach at Wharton, and when I was at Wharton, I used to have a monthly column for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the editorial board a couple times would invite me in for a lunch just to get to meet me and get to know who I was. And you'd be at the lunch, and these guys were talking openly about how the Democrats would have buses where they would go and take people from one polling station to the other. And I'm like, these guys, they're completely nonplussed about it. It's like, this is what happens all the time. But they wouldn't write about it. They wouldn't criticize it. I mean, I could go and quote them, but I'm not sure what that would do by itself. So a lot of places, this has just been kind of open secrets about the amount of fraud. It's just this last time, I think things really got into hyper gear here and really hit new dimensions in terms of the amount of fraud that was involved.
So in Syria, there was an election, and President Assad was reelected with 93% of the vote.
He's a very popular guy.
Yeah. I was wondering if you thought that
Not as popular as Putin.
I was just wondering if you thought maybe there could have been some fraud there.
I doubt it. No, I told you, he's a popular guy. Why would you think otherwise? It sounds like it's not a serious question. I don't know. Is it a serious question? Okay, I didn't think so. Well, I'll remind them, this gentleman's had his hand up for a while, but go ahead.
Back to the
I don't think he can walk around too much.
Back to the California election, and you've alluded to it a little bit when you're talking about Sidney Powell. I want to know, because I haven't heard anything. Is there actual evidence? Is there actual documents and federal charge, or not federal, but legal charges in the debacle in California? Or is it just someone said, I didn't get the vote? Because that means nothing.
Well, I mean, there were news reports. I don't know. I mean, they had interviewed a number of people who were talking about it at the time, who ran into problems. Look, here's the deal. We know that there were ballots being picked up that were in places that they shouldn't have been, large number of ballots. And, presumably some of those were voted. And so it's not too shocking that you're going to find people saying that I've been told that I've already voted. They had election officials that admitted that they were telling people that they were listed as already having voted. If you read the mainstream press in California, though, their thing is these are fixable problems, okay? And they're fixable because we either send out new ballots to the people whose ballots we found in cars, okay? Or we give people provisional ballots. And my point was, it's hard for me to understand this, that they don't understand that that doesn't completely fix the problem, okay? Because not everybody's going to vote. So, I mean, you can, look at the LA Times website and others, and you'll find articles explaining, look, there are these problems, but they're fixed. And I'm just saying, if you think that they're problems, these don't completely fix it.
Hi, thank you for your wisdom. There was a report that came out this morning from Maricopa. They analyzed roughly 650,000 of the voter rolls, and they matched it with whatever the requirement is in Arizona to the Social Security rolls. 58% of the 650,000 had no Social Security number.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen that yet, but I'm not surprised.
And
I mean, why? Look, I mean, even a lot of illegals have Social Security numbers. So it's just, but, if you don't have government-issued real IDs, I mean, the Carter-Baker Commission wasn't just saying a driver's license. They were saying, a real ID driver's license. And, but if you don't have those requirements, and even a lot of states like California and Maryland and other places give driver's license to people that they know are illegal, I'm glad that they looked at that type of thing. That's a lot. I mean, it's clear Maricopa County is the largest county in Arizona by far. Even if it was like 15%, it would have changed the election outcome. So, I mean, I'll have to look at that. If it came out this morning, I didn't have a chance to look at that. But I believe you. I don't know, 58% seems mind-boggling high, but I suppose anything's possible.
I do have a second part to this. I'm a former election official in Wisconsin. And when I voted in November, I was 1,423 that put my ballot through the machine. Our district has about 2,000 registered voters. There's no way in God's name that over 1,400 ballots could have gone through in 2.5 hours.
Okay, well, a lot of people that got there very early in the morning, I guess. Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know what to do about the anecdotal story, but I mean, I'm happy to believe your point there. I don't know. Look, I don't know when they may have put votes in or where state were you in? Wisconsin. Well, as I say, Wisconsin, it's coming out next week. There'll be local news reports, probably the end of next week, I'm willing to bet. At least I've been told it's going to be released next week. Indicates that there are about 92,000 more votes recorded in Wisconsin than there were people recorded as voting. Okay, well, is that where Madison is? Yeah, okay. Well, I understood that the biggest problems in terms of this discrepancy were in Milwaukee County and your county.
We now have time for one last question.
Sure.
we're the largest and presumably best democracy in the world. We think we are. Democracy depends on the voting key, right?
Yeah.
Okay, how can we possibly be living this long and having the worst of all these countries you've been showing us? And what does it take in order to get this fixed?
Well, you know, I don't know. I'm not sure we're moving in the right direction on these things. That may be related to the problem that you're speaking about. But how do we get it fixed? Well, you know, we have to make sure we have solid evidence that goes out there. We can't have any of this stuff like with Sidney Powell going on. And we have to, and you know, it's not stuff you get together instantly. And it's going to be a few months before it's kind of, we really have stuff put together systematically for a large portion of the country. But I think, you know, it's obviously we're not going to change the election in 2020. But what you can hopefully do is make people realize that there's a problem, make it so that the media can't always say, you know, it's a fiction or a lie or it's false that there's fraud that's occurring in these elections. And at least give the states that are considering legislation kind of more backbone or courage to go and pass basic reforms that are there. Unfortunately, a number of states are going the other way. You've had Colorado and Nevada and Illinois have recently passed things to kind of make their elections all mail-in voting. And so, you know, and obviously not only do they do that, but they allow vote harvesting. So you allow people to kind of go around from one place to another to collect the votes that are there and pressure people. You know, there's a reason why we adopted secret ballots. You don't want somebody looking over your shoulder or talking to you while you're filling out the voting form that's there. And so, you know, I hope we don't go back to the kind of the dark days where you had about 12% of voters were maybe getting paid to go and vote or being pressured in some way. Well, I really appreciate your time, and it's an awesome privilege to be invited back here again. Thank you very much.